Hello, good evening. It is your host, Emmanuel Isaiah Smith, and today's date is Tuesday, August 26th, 2025. The time is 7:53 p.m., and I am in downtown Miami, Florida. Today's lecture is entitled The First Amendment. And mind you, I enjoy doing these lectures outside, and from time to time I will have to raise my voice to drown out the background noise, which includes, at this particular area, which is right next to Fisher Island, so adjust your volume accordingly. I'd like to begin this lecture by stating that the First and Second Amendments to the United States Constitution are components of one another. The First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States guarantees free speech and freedom of expression to every citizen. It also guarantees freedom of the press, meaning that a well-regulated, energetic, and resourceful media in the United States is good for democracy because it promotes accountability not only with elected officials and corporate executives, but among all government staff members, as well as the United States populace itself. Furthermore, the media, particularly the press, which generates news stories and narratives and so forth, keep people in the know as to what's going on in the world around them. This is important because it allows people to make more informed decisions regarding their lives and the lives of their loved ones, namely based upon the kinds of things that are happening not only in their immediate vicinity, for example, their city or municipality, their township or village, but throughout the entire state, the entire country, and the entire world. The Second Amendment to the Constitution of the United States guarantees the right to bear arms. Now, there are obviously stipulations to that based upon where you live in the country. Some states have tighter gun laws than others. Here in the state of Florida, they have open carry. So for all intents and purposes, you can simply buy a firearm and just carry it anywhere here. Some people agree with that stipulation, some people don't. Me, I've reserved judgment until I can look into its auspices a bit further. I am certainly pro-gun rights. I do like the idea of regulated gun rights because, quite frankly, you could pass a background check and obtain a firearm at your local firearms store or at a gun show, or you can purchase them online, and you could be in the clear to purchase a firearm. But your psychological state when you purchase those firearms is not part of the approval process. You simply can't be a felon. Now, a firearm is a very dangerous weapon. It is a very effective weapon for home defense and for personal defense. And it's obviously an effective weapon for the defense of your loved ones. I think responsible gun owners should be able to purchase firearms at their leisure. And I think responsible gun laws ought to be in place to ensure that responsible, well-meaning, and healthy people obtain firearms. Me personally, when I first moved to Dayton, Ohio to go to school there, the first thing I did when I arrived in Dayton was I went online to gandermountain.com and I purchased a 6th generation SF21 45 caliber Glock handgun, and I added to it a tactical light, a precision laser, and an extended clip with hollow point bullets. I also bought myself a Bowie knife and some pepper spray to keep my home safe. And the reason I went through all this to keep my home safe, and quite frankly, that's not a lot. I mean, there are Americans that own dozens of firearms and various other weapons and keep them right in the home. But for me, it was a lot because it was my first weapons purchase. And the reason I purchased these weapons for my home in Dayton, Ohio, which it's not terribly crime-ridden, but quite frankly, you can never be too careful. A person's safety is everything. So, the reason I made these purchases was because this was around the summer of 2014. So this was around the time where I started noticing obvious changes in the world around me. And when I say the world around me, I'm not necessarily talking about the world according to the news media or the world according to our elected officials or the world according to anyone but myself. Because my world was different than the worlds of other people. And I noticed an uptick in disruptive, hostile, and dangerous activity and behavior by people to me and my belongings, particularly my property. And some of it just simply didn't make sense. And a lot of it seemed orchestrated or staged or derived from something. And I didn't quite know in 2014 how to quantify what was happening. I just knew I was encountering a lot of bizarre behaviors every day, seemingly all day, even on campus. At the time I was attending Wright State University. It's a beautiful college, good Air Force preparation programs there. Good communications program there, good political science program there. And I simply didn't know what was going on, so I just wanted to keep myself safe. So I made these weapons purchases. Now, 2 years later, by the time I had transferred to the University of Dayton to take up political science and pre-law, I had done enough research online and gathered enough information to realize that I was in the middle of a gang-stalking campaign. And the reason I knew I was in a gang-stalking campaign is because when I read online the information that was available, it was scarce information, but it was information nonetheless, valuable information to myself, who was researching various articles and topics on what you might refer to as organized stalking, which is what I felt like I was experiencing. And the descriptions that I read concerning gang stalking were so similar in scope and in action to what I was experiencing that I knew it was the same thing. So that's when I began to research a little bit more and open social media pages and various other websites, incorporated Bible discourses, semi-incorporated EIS media group, and went to work getting the word out about gang stalking, hoping it hits the right ears, particularly the ears of our elected officials at the federal level and the Supreme Court justices, because ultimately the repeal of the gang stalking mechanism is going to have to go through them. The Supreme Court is going to have to rule it unconstitutional, and the Congress of the United States is going to have to pass legislation to repeal it and end its funding. Because it is, ladies and gentlemen, a national security protocol. What is free speech? What is the First Amendment to the United States Constitution? And what is the freedom of expression? When I was a child and I read the United States Constitution for the first time, I was in awe at the wisdom, foresight, and sheer magnitude of its precepts. It is a pro-humanity document. And as a youngster, I applauded the United States, even though this document had been in play for 220 something odd years at that point. I applauded its founders, or its drafters, the American men that put this document together and set it in motion. I was very much inspired by them and appreciative that these men had the foresight to put this document at the cornerstone of the American governmental mechanism. It guarantees free speech. I read in various journals and magazines and articles, particularly in the early to mid 1990s, that a lot of other countries don't have quite the free speech opportunities and freedoms that the United States has. And I felt lucky. I remember feeling lucky as a young person growing up in the 1990s, that I had a constitution that guaranteed free speech. Because if a citizen of any country can get the word out about something, whether it's a compliment, a suggestion, or a concern, you can praise the United States, you can comment on the United States, you can criticize the United States. And all of these various modes of communication are protected by the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. I remember growing up feeling lucky that I lived in a country that valued free speech, because ultimately free speech is a component of freedom. It's a component of liberty. It is a component of a government's ability to trust its citizens. A government that allows its citizens to speak freely is a government that trusts its citizens. Now, freedom of speech and freedom of expression are those instances of a government honoring its social contract to its citizens. The political theorist Thomas Hobbes described the relationship between a government and its citizens as a social contract. You go into a contract with your government when you're born into this country. The contract is simple. If you abide by the laws and pay your taxes, your government will provide resources, namely taxpayer-funded resources, that you are going to be able to use freely. Furthermore, you'll have your freedom and can pursue your life's interests at your leisure. Society won't disrupt you, and you won't disrupt society. Now, what happens when these social contracts become dishonorable? What happens when the social contract that you go into with your government provides for something like gang-stalking, which is a mobile harassment, containment, and disruption mechanism that seeks to subvert a person's life in every possible way? Ladies and gentlemen, freedom of speech is important in times like these. I said earlier in this lecture that freedom of speech and the right to bear arms are components of one another. And indeed they are. Indeed, these rights coincide with each other. And indeed, these rights cooperate with each other. How does freedom of speech and freedom of expression cooperate with the right to bear arms? Well, it was said best by the founding fathers. And I have no problem calling the drafters of the Magna Carta, the Declaration of Independence, the United States Constitution, or the Bill of Rights founding fathers, because they got together in various conventions and without respect to theology or anything beyond what we can see, or rather what the Greek philosopher Plato would call the intelligible realm, they crafted these documents that were very pro-citizen. So in my mind, they are the founding fathers of this country. Now, the United States was a little different in 1787 than it is in 2025. Things are a little different now. People are different. The economy is different. Politics are different. Opportunities are different. The business cycle is different. The way people carry about their lives is different. And people's expectations for their government is different now than it was 260 years ago. But regardless of the changing of the times, the precepts of the United States Constitution remain constant. Freedom of speech is important. Freedom of the press is important. The right to defend yourself is important. The right to vote in elections is important. The right to habeas corpus is important. The right to worship as you please is important, although I don't believe it's quite as important as the freedom of speech, because religion can become corrupt. Religious leaders can become corrupt. And religion can facilitate tyranny if it is not properly checked by the United States federal government. Now, I am totally in favor of the separation of church and state. And the reason I'm in favor of the separation of church and state is because the state has to focus on the intelligible. That means what we can see, what we can perceive with our senses. The Greek philosopher Plato talked about the intelligible realm as opposed to the unintelligible realm, which is the unseen, in quite a few, in quite a bit of detail in his Forms manuscript. So let's focus on the intelligible realm, what we can sense, what we can see. That's what government is here to protect. It's not a politician's job to tell you to do A, B, and C to get to heaven. Okay? That's your pastor's job. That's your rabbi's job. That's your cleric's job, your clergyman's job, your priest's job. That's the job of Bibles and Qurans and New Testaments and Old Testaments and Buddhist manuscripts and the Rig Veda and so many other religious documents that have existed from pagan times until the present. That's their focus, is being moral here on earth and making it to a better destination in the afterlife. That's the goal of religion. But that cannot be successfully infused into the political discussion, because politics, government, the rule of law, it has to operate irrespective of religion. It doesn't matter if you are a Christian, a Jew, a Muslim, a Buddhist, an atheist, what have you. The law, the government, its precepts, and its mechanisms are to treat us all the same. If you're going to talk about the United States in any capacity, you have to talk about it as an experiment. Clearing my throat, ladies and gentlemen. It's described as an experiment by the founding fathers of this country. Now, it's an experiment like this. It's about democracy. It's about the people's choice. It's about freedom, and it's about liberty, all under the guidance of the law. Has that experiment worked? If you asked me that question 20 years ago, I'd say absolutely. Look at this thriving civilization that we call the United States. Look at its economy. Look at its political structure. Look at its government. Look at its influence worldwide. Look at its military. Look at its law enforcement mechanism. Look at its schools and churches. I would have told you, yes, the American experiment is a success. Freedom, justice, liberty, and rights under a constitution has worked in America. That's what I'd have told you 20 years ago. Now today, today I would say to that same question, I don't know. I think it has morphed this country to where some are benefited and some are not. Now, who's benefited is not based on just one factor. It's based on a lot of factors. Okay? There is literally a points system that is based on a number of variables that place certain citizens above other citizens with respect to the American hierarchy. And yes, one of the things that made America a romantic place to live in was that there was no real established class system here. There was no caste system here. Yes, some people had more than others, but ultimately, if you apply yourself to whatever it is you decide to do in life, you can have a good future. Okay, and that was evidenced particularly in the 90s and early to mid 2000s, when you saw everyday people who were raised in blue-collar homes doing exceptionally well for themselves in various entrepreneurial endeavors. And you know, we heard this a lot during that time period among people who had established themselves and became renowned despite their average origins. They would say things like, I was the first person in my family to go to college. I was the first person in my family to get a degree. I was the first person in my family to make 6 figures, 7 figures, 10 figures. I was the first person in my family to leave behind wealth to my progeny. We heard this a lot in the United States, and we heard it more in the United States in that time period, particularly the 90s through the mid 2000s, than any other country in the world. You are free in the United States to do well if you apply yourself. Now, how does gang-stalking disrupt that beautiful American dream I just laid out for you? With gang-stalking, you can be placed in a very thuggish containment mechanism that deprives you of the ability to live your life in such a way that is conducive to your success. And it is done through a personnel mobilization mechanism that is aimed at annoying, hindering, disrupting, slowing down, and yes, harming a targeted person for reasons that have not been made known to that person. Now, the program has to be federal because it follows a targeted individual across state lines. As I've said many times, I've lived in Ohio, Tennessee, and Florida. I've experienced gang stalking in all three states. My First Amendment rights are important to me because they allow me to communicate. Just think of it. Think of all the political conundrums that have happened throughout history. In this country, think of the Great Depression of the 1930s. People had to communicate how they felt about that. Think about World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. As a matter of fact, an excellent example of the freedom of speech in action was none other than Senator John Kerry concerning the Vietnam War. Now, mind you, Senator John McCain had some interesting experiences in Vietnam as well on the Republican side. He was actually a POW who survived and was able to come back to America and do very well in politics. But in the 2004 election, I was, as a 19-year-old young person, I was very impressed with the incumbent President George W. Bush for the Republicans and Senator John Kerry for the Democrats, who I just mentioned. I was impressed with both of them. I thought they were both phenomenal campaigners, and I thought they were both phenomenal debaters. I mean, I tuned into all their presidential debates, and quite frankly, I thought that they were all incredible. They were extremely well versed in the message that they wanted to convey. And at that point in my young life, 19 years old, I had not registered to vote. I didn't register till I was 21. So I didn't vote in that election. But I knew that there were two very potent political candidates that were running, and I knew that America as a political entity would gain regardless of who became president. And as we all know, President George W. Bush won that presidency because the people liked his idea for his strategy for Iraq better than they did John Kerry's strategy for Iraq. That was the central debate. Now, when John Kerry was a 27-year-old young person, he came back from Vietnam and was highly critical of the United States. He was very critical as to how the United States prosecuted the war in Vietnam. He described kamikaze-style search and destroy missions where U.S. soldiers were going into Vietnamese villages and massacring hundreds of people without prejudice. He described some horrific scenes, and the American people were divided on what this young soldier, who was a Purple Heart recipient, was saying about the United States as an entity. He described the massacres as Genghis Khan style massacres. And as we all know, Genghis Khan is the world famous former emperor of the Mongol Empire, which is one of the largest recorded empires in modern history. It reached its peak, if I'm not mistaken, in the 1300s. It could have been sooner, but I know it was the Middle Ages. And Genghis Khan was a conquering emperor and a brilliant military strategist. Mongolia being an eastern country that is situated near China and Russia. It's an Oriental empire. John Kerry used his freedom of speech in the 1960s and 70s to talk about the horrors in Vietnam. John Kerry didn't believe that the United States was being responsible in how it was prosecuting that war. Now, John Kerry's patriotism was no doubt questioned. There are some Americans that, immediately question your patriotism if you criticize the United States or any of its governmental components. There are people that will say that you're unpatriotic if you criticize the United States societal components. Clearing my throat, ladies and gentlemen. That was one of the things about Senator Kerry's candidacy that I admired. All right, I got a tow truck that just pulled up. This looks like street theater. I think the timing is very odd. I have been talking for about 40 minutes, and I am, quite frankly, I'm on the corner of Bridge Road and Star Island, which is kind of a bayside type of area. There's not much to do here. There's not much going on here. It's just a nice area to take pictures and enjoy the breeze, see some sights, enjoy the water. And there's nothing going on here right now. As a matter of fact, my exact location is shown at the very beginning of this video, the prelude. The watery area with the cruise ships and the various other monuments and structures, and the bridges and high-rises and the bay. That's where I am right now. Although it's dark outside now, the prelude is bright. But over the last 40 minutes, it's gotten dark. There are no cars over here. There are no trucks over here. There's nothing over here. But a tow truck has just pulled up next to me at this bus stop that I'm doing this discourse at. And mind you, the reason I chose this spot was because I figured it'd be quiet, that I wouldn't be disrupted. As I so often am during these lectures. So I figured to come here because I figured it'd be peaceful and serene and I could get through the lecture with no problem. But here's this tow truck that just drove up. There's nothing around, ladies and gentlemen, but cars passing by. The only vehicles that have any reason to stop where I am right now are the metro buses. There is no reason that any person with common sense would see a need for a tow truck to pull up right now. There are no cars, there are no trucks, there's nothing broken down. There's no conceivable reason for a tow truck to be here. But this is a gang-stalking campaign, ladies and gentlemen, and as I said in my previous lectures, gang-stalking does not sleep, and the targeted individual is constantly disrupted. It doesn't matter where he is or what he is doing. So in many respects, what this says to me is that whatever federal auxiliary is prosecuting my gang-stalking campaign, they don't have enough respect for anything that I do to the point where I can do a lecture on this political conundrum that affects lots of people in various ways without some sort of disruption or psychological war tactic, which is what this is. But I'm going to get back to the lecture as I always do, because the lecture is more important than this funny street theater. Now, John Kerry was no doubt a patriot in my mind because, quite frankly, political dissidence is patriotic. Because ultimately what you're going to do is you're going to get your country back on track if it falls off track. All right, the tow truck is pulling off. No reason whatsoever why it stopped, but now it's leaving. But ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, people are not perfect. So governments are not going to be perfect. If a government strays from its core precepts, particularly a constitutional republic and a democracy that the United States is, only political dissidence is going to get the country back on track. Because if you just go with the flow, the trajectory of your life will be less than it could be. So ultimately, I commend John Kerry for what he did after Vietnam. As a U.S. citizen, he saw a problem and he spoke up even against his own government, so that that problem could be examined and remedied. Now, there are Republicans who have done the same thing and spoken out against tyranny. Now, clearing my throat, ladies and gentlemen. Now, with Republicans, for example, I think Republicans have a different political philosophy as to what's patriotic and what ain't. When I think about a politician, for example, who used his First Amendment rights well, it was Senator John McCain. another Vietnam War veteran, who later in his life, particularly in the 2008 presidential election campaign, which he won the Republican nomination, by the way, and faced then Senator Barack Obama in the general election. John McCain was considered a maverick by the Senate because he often broke with his party on certain issues and asserted his own idea of how things should be in this country legislatively. One of the things John McCain talked about a lot in that 2008 presidential campaign was pork barrel spending and earmarks. Now, Senator McCain's commentary on government waste, particularly in the form of pork barrel spending and earmarks, influenced my thinking as a young person. I was 23 when that 2008 election took place. And at the age of 23, his comments on pork and wasteful spending, misappropriations, had an effect on me. Because it wasn't until John McCain went public with information concerning earmarks, which are basically stipulations that can be inserted into legislative bills that get legalized along with the bill, can be wasteful and harmful, and can provide for negativities in government. John McCain used to often say this: if I become president, I'm going to ask for the line item veto. The line item veto is a presidential power that used to exist but no longer exists, that allowed a president, a sitting president, to comb through a bill that comes to his desk for his signature and examine all the stipulations of the bill, and he was able to manually delete any stipulation that he saw as useless, wasteful, or deleterious. He said, if I become president, I'm going to ask for the line item veto. And if anyone tries to put any earmarks, any wasteful spending, any misappropriation, or any pork in any legislation that comes to my desk, I'm going to make the creators of that pork famous, and not in a good way. Meaning he was going to make the authors of the pork or misappropriation known to the public. Hey, these men put together a bill and inserted stipulations in the bill that were wasteful, useless, and costly to the American taxpayer, and no good for freedom or democracy. So John McCain went out on a limb by talking about these things. And mind you, citizens like myself have freedom of speech, of course, but so do law enforcers, so do military personnel, so do teachers, so do doctors and nurses, so do fire and EMS, so do politicians. Everyone born into this country is entitled to the constitutional precept of the freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And if people do not like that, then they have the opportunity to form a counter argument or just change the channel. And quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, given the nature of what I talk about, and yes, I am highly critical of the United States federal establishment for its negligence in allowing gang stalking to be implemented and sustained using taxpayer resources. This is obviously a botched national security protocol.